The entire terminal fell silent as Elijah Washington's voice thundered through the airport. The airline's CEO, who had denied him first-class boarding minutes earlier, now turned pale, frantically ordering staff to reopen the gates. Nobody realized that within hours, every flight nationwide would be grounded. Before I dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination at an airport, and subscribe to hear more incredible stories of justice being served. Now let's see how a simple boarding denial turned into a corporate earthquake. Long before Elijah Washington became the man who could shut down an entire airline with a single phone call, he was just a bright-eyed kid from East Baltimore with big dreams. Growing up in a neighborhood where success stories were rare, Elijah stood out from an early age. His mother Dorothy, a public school teacher, instilled in him a love for learning that became his ticket out of poverty. Unlike many of his peers who attended prestigious private schools, Elijah started at Baltimore City Community College, working nights at a local gas station to pay for his courses. Despite maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA, he constantly faced professors and classmates who questioned whether he belonged in higher education. "You're smart for a kid from your neighborhood," one professor told him after he aced a difficult programming exam, the backhanded compliment revealing more than the speaker intended. Elijah never forgot those words. They fueled him when he applied to transfer to MIT, despite his guidance counselor suggesting he set more realistic goals. When the acceptance letter came, he framed it alongside that counselor's dismissive evaluation. At MIT, the prejudice continued but took more subtle forms. Study groups mysteriously had no room when he asked to join. Professors seemed surprised when he contributed valuable insights in class discussions. Job recruiters would enthusiastically chat with his white classmates but give him cursory interviews. "It's not what they say," Elijah once explained to his roommate Andre Johnson. "It's the surprise in their eyes when I demonstrate basic competence, as though they expected me to fail." Despite these challenges, Elijah graduated near the top of his class with a double major in computer science and business administration. His thesis on predictive encryption algorithms caught the attention of several major tech companies, but Elijah had other plans. Instead of accepting lucrative job offers, he returned to Baltimore and started Washington Securities from his tiny apartment. The early days were lean and difficult. With only 2 employees, himself and a fellow MIT graduate named Tanya Wilson, they worked 18-hour days developing innovative cybersecurity solutions. Their breakthrough came when a small government contractor experienced a devastating hack and needed immediate intervention. Larger firms quoted weeks for the job. Elijah promised a solution in 72 hours. He didn't sleep for those 3 days, but he delivered. That client recommended Washington Securities to others, and within 3 years, the company had grown to 50 employees. Now, 12 years later, Washington Securities employed over 5,000 people globally and was valued at $6 billion. The company had revolutionized how government agencies and corporations protected their most sensitive data, with proprietary systems that were virtually unhackable. Their client list included defense contractors, airlines, major banks, and government departments. Despite his meteoric rise, Elijah maintained his humble roots. He established scholarships for students from his old neighborhood, funded coding programs in underprivileged schools, and remained connected to the community that shaped him. He drove the same modest car for years and lived well below his means, focusing on building his company rather than flaunting his wealth. Yet his success couldn't shield him from racism. If anything, it sometimes made the prejudice more acute. At industry events, he was still mistaken for wait staff. At high-end stores, security guards followed him closely. In boardrooms, new contacts often directed their questions to his white employees, assuming Elijah couldn't be the CEO. Through it all, Elijah maintained a philosophy of quiet dignity. "Success is my loudest response," he often said. Rather than confronting every microaggression, he channeled his energy into building his empire and creating opportunities for others who looked like him. The recent acquisition of several major government contracts had put Washington Securities in the spotlight more than ever before. The company was on track to be the primary cybersecurity provider for multiple federal agencies, a responsibility that came with intense scrutiny and pressure. This new phase meant constant travel for Elijah, flying between Washington, D.C., Silicon Valley, and various government facilities around the country. The toll on his personal life was significant. His last relationship had ended largely because of his packed schedule, and he rarely saw his aging mother as much as he wanted to. Tanya Wilson, who had been with him since day one, had risen to become his executive assistant and right hand. Her organizational skills and fierce loyalty made Elijah's impossible schedule somewhat manageable. She anticipated problems before they arose and shielded him from distractions that would waste his valuable time. "Your flight to San Francisco is confirmed for 2:15, Tanya informed him on that fateful Tuesday morning. "The meeting with the Defense Department procurement team is set for tomorrow at 9 a.m. If all goes well, we should have the final signatures on the $2 billion contract by end of day." This contract was the culmination of years of work. It would cement Washington Securities as a major player in the defense industry and create hundreds of new jobs. As one of the few black CEOs in the Fortune 500, Elijah felt the weight of representation on his shoulders. His success or failure wouldn't be viewed as simply his own, fairly or unfairly, it would reflect on other black professionals in the tech industry. "Everything ready on our end?" Elijah asked, reviewing the presentation materials on his tablet. "All set," Tanya confirmed. "The team has triple-checked the proposal. Legal has reviewed all documentation. Our technical demonstration is scheduled for 11 a.m. tomorrow. The Pentagon rep specifically requested that you personally walk them through the advanced features." Elijah nodded, closing his tablet. "Then I better make sure I get to San Francisco today." He had no idea that getting on that plane would become the challenge that would change everything. Reagan National Airport buzzed with the typical Tuesday afternoon energy, business travelers rushing to make connections, tourists studying gate information, and airport staff directing the controlled chaos. Elijah Washington moved through the terminal with practiced ease, having traveled this route dozens of times before. Unlike many executives of his stature, Elijah preferred to dress comfortably while traveling. Today he wore dark jeans, a plain gray hoodie over a black t-shirt, and his favorite worn-in sneakers. His only concessions to his status were his premium noise-canceling headphones and the high-end leather backpack that carried his laptop. He found that dressing down not only made the travel experience more comfortable but also gave him valuable insights into how people treated him when they didn't recognize him as a wealthy CEO. His VIP check-in experience had gone smoothly. The agent at the premium counter had been professional and efficient, checking his ID, issuing his boarding pass, and directing him to the first-class lounge. There, Elijah had spent an hour reviewing his presentation and answering urgent emails before the boarding announcement for his flight to San Francisco. As Elijah approached Gate 35, he noticed the first-class boarding process had already begun. A small line of well-dressed passengers was moving through the priority lane. He joined the queue, pulling out his boarding pass on his phone. "First-class boarding only at this time," announced a sharp voice that seemed to be directed specifically at him. Elijah looked up to see a middle-aged white man in an Atlantic Airways management uniform staring pointedly at him. The brass name tag on his jacket read, "Bradley Keller, Regional Manager." "Yes, I'm aware," Elijah replied evenly, holding up his phone to show his first-class boarding pass. "I'm in seat 2A. Bradley Keller's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze moving from Elijah's casual clothes to his face with poorly disguised skepticism. "May I see some ID with that boarding pass, sir?" he asked, emphasizing the "sir" in a way that stripped the word of any respect. Elijah noticed that none of the other passengers in the first-class line, all of whom were white, had been asked for additional identification. Still, he calmly reached for his wallet and produced his driver's license. Keller examined the ID with exaggerated care, looking back and forth between the license and Elijah's face multiple times. "Washington. Elijah Washington," he mumbled, as though testing whether the name was fabricated. "That's correct," Elijah confirmed, maintaining his composure. "And how did you come to be in first class today, Mr. Washington?" Keller asked, making no move to return the ID or allow Elijah to proceed. The question hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone within earshot. Several passengers looked over with interest, and a gate agent glanced up from her computer with visible discomfort. "I purchased a first-class ticket," Elijah responded simply. "As do most people in this line." Keller's mouth tightened. "We've had issues with boarding pass irregularities recently. I'm just doing my job ensuring everyone is in their proper place." "I understand," Elijah said, though they both knew what was really happening. "May I board now? I believe they've called my group." Instead of returning his ID and allowing him to proceed, Keller took Elijah's phone and walked over to the gate agent's desk. "Nancy, can you verify this boarding pass? Something doesn't seem right." The gate agent, Nancy Chen, looked uncomfortable but took the phone and ID. She typed something into her computer, then looked up with a professional smile. "Everything checks out, Mr. Keller. Mr. Washington is confirmed in seat 2A. Rather than acknowledging his error, Keller frowned. "Are you sure? Check again. Maybe there was a last-minute change." By now, the boarding process had stalled. Passengers behind Elijah were growing restless, and others were watching the scene unfold with varying expressions of confusion, discomfort, and in some cases, recognition of what was happening. Nancy checked again, clearly embarrassed. "Sir, Mr. Washington is properly booked in first class. His ticket was purchased 3 weeks ago." Keller finally returned Elijah's phone and ID but made one last attempt. "You know," he said in a lowered voice that was still audible to those nearby, "you might be more comfortable in economy with, well, people like you. First class can be quite formal. The dress code and expectations are different." A few gasps could be heard from witnesses. One woman covered her mouth in shock. The implication was unmistakable. Keller didn't believe someone who looked like Elijah belonged in first class, regardless of what his ticket said. Elijah felt the familiar burn of humiliation and anger that he'd experienced countless times before, but he'd learned long ago that showing those emotions would only reinforce stereotypes. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked Keller directly in the eyes. "I'm quite comfortable in first class," he said evenly. "I fly this route twice a month." "Well, policy states that I can refuse boarding to anyone who doesn't meet our standards," Keller replied, crossing his arms. "And frankly, your attire and attitude don't meet Atlantic Airways first-class standards today." The situation had escalated beyond what Elijah had expected. Usually, these incidents resolved after some initial discomfort. The prejudiced party would reluctantly do their job once they realized they couldn't find a legitimate reason to exclude him. But Keller seemed determined to make a point. Public embarrassment be damned. "Are you refusing to let me board?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but firm. "I'm suggesting you might want to consider economy class instead," Keller replied with a thin smile. "Or perhaps another flight altogether. I'm getting the sense that you might be a disruption to our premium cabin experience." The boarding line had completely stopped now. Everyone was watching the confrontation unfold. Some had taken out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Elijah Washington had faced discrimination throughout his life, but rarely had it been so blatant, so public, and so consequential. With a crucial meeting just hours away that could determine the future of his company, he now faced a choice: back down and accept the humiliation to make his flight, or stand his ground and risk missing a $2 billion opportunity. What he didn't know was that this moment would trigger a chain of events that would shake an entire corporation to its foundation. "Mr. Keller," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the anger churning inside him, "I'd like your employee ID number and the name of your supervisor." The request seemed to catch Bradley Keller off guard. His smug expression faltered momentarily before hardening into something more defensive. Are you threatening me? Keller demanded, raising his voice so that nearby passengers could hear. I'm simply enforcing company policy. I'm not threatening anyone, Elijah replied calmly. I'm requesting information that any customer has the right to ask for. Your employee ID and supervisor's name, please. Keller's face flushed red. I don't have to give you that. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have security remove you from the gate area. Several passengers had now openly taken out their phones, recording the interaction. One woman in a business suit looked particularly disturbed by what she was witnessing. I'm not being disruptive, Elijah stated firmly. I presented a valid first-class ticket and ID. The gate agent confirmed my booking. You're denying me boarding based on how I look, not company policy. That's a serious accusation, Keller snapped. Security. We have a situation at gate 35. Two airport security officers approached quickly, their expressions already set in stern lines. Elijah noted with bitter familiarity how they positioned themselves closer to him than to Keller, automatically assuming he was the problem. What's the issue here? Asked the older officer, directing his question to Keller rather than assessing the situation impartially. This man is creating a disturbance and refusing to comply with boarding procedures, Keller said before Elijah could speak. He's insisting on boarding first class despite not meeting our standards, and now he's making accusations of discrimination. The security officers turned to Elijah, their posture becoming more rigid. Sir, we need you to step aside and calm down, the younger officer instructed. Have you ever been in a situation where authority figures immediately assume you're in the wrong based solely on appearance? Comment number 1 if you've experienced this kind of prejudgment, and like this video if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of how they dress. Subscribe to see more stories of justice and accountability. But what would you do if you were in Elijah's shoes? Would you back down to make your flight or stand your ground against injustice? I am calm, Elijah responded, keeping his hands visible. I have a valid first-class ticket. The gate agent verified it. Mr. Keller is refusing to let me board because of my appearance, not because of any policy violation. He's being confrontational, Keller insisted. We have the right to deny boarding to any passenger who presents a potential problem. As the situation threatened to spiral further, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Elijah. There you are. Tanya Wilson strode purposefully toward the gate, her professional appearance in stark contrast to Elijah's casual attire. She carried a tablet and wore the confident expression of someone accustomed to solving problems. I'm sorry I'm late, she said, positioning herself beside Elijah. Is there an issue with our boarding? Keller glanced between them, his expression shifting to one of calculation. And you are? Tanya Wilson, executive assistant to Mr. Washington, she replied crisply. We're traveling to San Francisco for a meeting with the Department of Defense tomorrow morning. Is there a problem with our first-class reservations? Keller's attitude didn't improve with Tanya's arrival. If anything, he seemed more determined to assert his authority. I was explaining to your employer that his appearance doesn't meet our first-class standards. And I don't appreciate his accusations of discrimination. Tanya's eyes narrowed slightly. I've reviewed Atlantic Airways' dress code policy thoroughly, Mr. Keller. There's nothing in it that prohibits what Mr. Washington is wearing. Many of your first-class passengers dress comfortably for transcontinental flights. It's at my discretion, Keller insisted, now addressing Tanya rather than Elijah, as if she were the only one worth speaking to. And I've made my decision. Excuse me, interrupted a voice from the line. The businesswoman who had been watching stepped forward. I'd like to say something. All eyes turned to her as she approached. My name is Grace Hoffman. I'm an attorney with Hoffman & Associates, and I fly first class with Atlantic Airways weekly. I've worn jeans and sweaters numerous times without issue. What's happening here is clearly discriminatory treatment. Keller's face darkened. This doesn't concern you, ma'am. It concerns all of us when we witness injustice, Grace replied firmly. And I've been recording this interaction. Mr. Washington has been nothing but polite while you've been condescending and obstructive. The security officers exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation now that a white professional woman had vouched for Elijah. Keller pulled out his phone. I need to call my supervisor. He stepped aside and had a brief, intense conversation, his back turned but his angry gestures visible to everyone. When he returned, a new man accompanied him, older, with silver hair and an executive's bearing. Mr. Washington, I'm Vincent Parker, Operations Director for Atlantic Airways at Reagan National. I understand there's been some confusion about our boarding process. There's no confusion, Elijah stated. Your regional manager refused to let me board despite my valid first-class ticket. He suggested I would be more comfortable in economy with people like me. The discrimination couldn't be clearer. Parker's expression didn't change. That's a very serious allegation. Mr. Keller is one of our most experienced managers. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about our premium cabin expectations. There was no misunderstanding, Grace Hoffman interjected. I witnessed the entire exchange. It was textbook discrimination. Parker's professional veneer remained intact, but his eyes hardened. Ms. Hoffman, while we appreciate your concern, this is a matter between Atlantic Airways and Mr. Washington. A matter that's currently being live-streamed to social media, Tanya pointed out, gesturing to the numerous phones recording the scene. And trending, based on the notifications I'm receiving. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Parker's face. He turned to Elijah with a practiced smile. Mr. Washington, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can come to an accommodation. I think we're past that point, Elijah replied. He pulled out his own phone and dialed a number from memory. The gate area grew quiet as Elijah waited for the call to connect. When it did, his tone changed to one of clear authority. This is Elijah Washington, authorization code Delta 972 Echo. I need an emergency system maintenance protocol initiated for Atlantic Airways. Priority level 1. He paused, listening. Yes, full network. No, this isn't a drill. I want it done in the next 10 minutes. Thank you. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression betraying nothing. Who was that? Parker demanded, his professional demeanor slipping. What do you think you're doing? I'm responding to a security situation, Elijah replied calmly. Sometimes systems need to be reset to correct fundamental errors. The cryptic response left Parker looking confused and increasingly concerned. Meanwhile, the crowd around the gate had grown, with passengers from neighboring gates drifting over to witness the commotion. Social media posts about the incident were multiplying by the second, with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #Atlantic Airways discrimination already gaining traction. No one yet realized that Elijah Washington had just set in motion events that would ground every Atlantic Airways flight across the country. The confrontation at Gate 35 was about to evolve from a personal humiliation into a corporate crisis of unprecedented proportions. Do you think Elijah's response was justified, or did he go too far? Comment number 1 if you believe sometimes you need to use your power to fight injustice, or number 2 if you think he should have found another way. Like and subscribe to see how this power move changes everything. What do you think will happen when that phone call takes effect? Elijah ended his mysterious call and turned back to face Bradley Keller and Vincent Parker. The two airline executives exchanged worried glances, clearly unsettled by Elijah's calm confidence but not yet understanding the significance of what had just transpired. Mr. Washington, Parker began, attempting to regain control of the situation. Whatever you're trying to do won't change the fact that we have protocols. You might want to check your computer systems, Elijah interrupted quietly. As if on cue, the gate agent's expression changed from uncomfortable to alarmed. Mr. Parker, she called urgently, something's wrong with the system. Parker reluctantly broke away to check the computer terminal. The color drained from his face as he stared at the screen. "What's happening?" he demanded. "Everything's going offline," the agent replied, frantically clicking through screens that were rapidly displaying error messages. "I can't access any passenger information. The boarding system is completely down." Throughout the terminal, similar scenes were unfolding at every Atlantic Airways gate. Agents found themselves unable to scan boarding passes. Flight information displays flickered and went dark. Lines of passengers began to form as the smooth process of boarding multiple flights simultaneously ground to a halt. Bradley Keller hurried over to another terminal, typing frantically on the keyboard. "This isn't just our gate," he reported, his voice tight with stress. "It's the entire system." The realization dawned slowly on Parker's face as he turned back to Elijah. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Elijah replied calmly. "Washington Securities did what it's contractually obligated to do in case of a security concern." "Washington Securities?" Parker repeated, confusion evident in his voice. "My company," Elijah explained. "We provide the cybersecurity infrastructure for Atlantic Airways' entire reservation and operation systems. Have for the past 4 years." The impact of this revelation hit Parker like a physical blow. His face paled further as he processed the implications. "You're that Washington?" "I am," Elijah confirmed. "And our contract includes emergency override protocols for system maintenance and security threats." By now, chaos was spreading throughout the airport. Atlantic Airways staff were rushing between gates, shouting into radios and making urgent phone calls. Passengers were growing increasingly frustrated as no information was forthcoming about the sudden technological collapse. An announcement echoed through the terminal, "Attention all passengers, Atlantic Airways is currently experiencing technical difficulties with our computer systems. All departures are delayed until further notice. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide updates as they become available." Bradley Keller's phone began ringing. He answered it with visible trepidation, listening for several seconds before his expression transformed into one of pure panic. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here. I understand. Right away, sir." He ended the call and turned to Parker, whispering urgently. Parker's eyes widened. "How widespread is this?" he asked Elijah, his tone now considerably more respectful. "National," Elijah replied simply. "Every Atlantic Airways system in every airport across the country. Reservations, check-in, boarding, baggage, operations, all of it. You can't do this." Keller burst out, his earlier smugness replaced by desperate anger. "This is illegal. It's terrorism." "Actually, it's completely legal," Tanya interjected, her tablet now displaying what appeared to be a contract. Section 27. 3 of our service agreement specifically authorizes Washington Securities to initiate emergency system maintenance in response to potential security vulnerabilities. The contract was signed by your CEO, Richard Montgomery, himself. The mention of the CEO seemed to trigger another wave of panic in Parker. His phone buzzed continuously with incoming calls and messages. He glanced at the screen and visibly flinched. "Mr. Montgomery is calling an emergency meeting," he informed Keller. "He's on his way here now." "The CEO is coming here?" "To the gate?" Keller asked incredulously. "Apparently, he's already at the airport for a board meeting," Parker replied grimly. "And yes, he's coming directly here." The news spread quickly among the Atlantic Airways staff, who began hurriedly straightening their uniforms and attempting to look efficient despite the technological meltdown. The atmosphere at Gate 35 had transformed completely, the power dynamic reversed so thoroughly it was almost palpable in the air. Tanya leaned close to Elijah. "Richard Montgomery himself," she murmured. "That was faster than I expected." "He knows what this is costing them by the minute," Elijah replied quietly. Every grounded flight, every stranded passenger, every missed connection, it's hemorrhaging money and reputation simultaneously. Indeed, the financial damage was mounting exponentially. Atlantic Airways operated over 2,000 flights daily across the country. With every one of those flights now grounded indefinitely, the airline was losing millions of dollars per hour. Beyond the immediate financial impact, the reputational damage would be incalculable if the systems remained down for an extended period. Reports were already coming in from other airports. At O'Hare in Chicago, over 30 Atlantic Airways flights were sitting immobile at gates. At Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson, the busiest airport in the world, a similar scene was unfolding. Los Angeles, Denver, Miami, at every major hub, Atlantic Airways operations had ceased entirely. Richard Montgomery arrived at gate 35 20 minutes later, flanked by 2 assistants who were frantically taking notes as he barked instructions. The CEO of Atlantic Airways was a tall, imposing figure in his early 60s, with the weathered face of someone who had navigated numerous corporate crises. Today, however, he looked distinctly rattled. He spotted Parker and made a beeline toward him, not yet noticing Elijah. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded. "The board meeting just got interrupted with news that our entire system is down nationwide." "Sir," Parker began nervously, "we have a situation with Elijah Washington," Montgomery finished as his gaze landed on Elijah. Recognition, followed by understanding, flashed across his face. "Washington Securities." "Mr. Montgomery," Elijah acknowledged with a slight nod. The airline CEO assessed the situation quickly, taking in the crowd of onlookers, the phones still recording, and the general atmosphere of tension. With a sharp gesture to his entourage to stay back, he approached Elijah directly. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and conciliatory, "I understand there's been an unfortunate incident. Whatever it is, I'm sure we can resolve it without resorting to such dramatic measures. Your regional manager denied me boarding because of the color of my skin," Elijah stated plainly. "When I calmly questioned this, he called security and your operations director backed him up. This isn't an unfortunate incident, it's discrimination, plain and simple." Montgomery's gaze shifted to Keller, who seemed to shrink under the CEO's scrutiny. "Is this true?" he demanded. "Sir, I was simply enforcing our standards," Keller began, his voice higher than normal. "He wasn't dressed appropriately for first class, and his attitude, I've seen passengers in first class wearing everything from suits to pajamas," Montgomery cut him off. "What exactly was inappropriate about Mr. Washington's attire?" Keller stammered, unable to formulate a coherent response that wouldn't explicitly reveal his prejudice. Montgomery turned back to Elijah. "Mr. Washington, on behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to personally apologize for this inexcusable treatment. Mr. Keller's actions do not reflect our company values or policies." He shot a venomous look at Keller. "And as of this moment, Mr. Keller is no longer employed by Atlantic Airways." The public firing was clearly meant as a peace offering, a sacrifice to appease Elijah and persuade him to restore the systems. But the apology rang hollow, the kind of corporate damage control that acknowledged the symptom while ignoring the disease. "I appreciate the gesture," Elijah replied, "but this isn't about one employee. It's about a pattern of behavior that your company has enabled and covered up. Mr. Keller felt comfortable doing what he did because there's a culture that permits it." Montgomery's practiced smile faltered. "I assure you, Atlantic Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. This is an isolated incident." "Is it?" Tanya interjected, her tablet now displaying a spreadsheet. "Because our research indicates Atlantic Airways has settled no fewer than 27 discrimination complaints in the past 3 years alone. All quietly, all with non-disclosure agreements." The CEO's face tightened. His gaze darted around the gate area, acutely aware of the growing media presence. A local news crew had arrived, setting up equipment just beyond the gate area. Mr. Washington, Montgomery said, lowering his voice, what will it take to resolve this situation? We have thousands of passengers stranded across the country. This is causing incalculable damage. That's exactly the point, Elijah replied. When discrimination affects your bottom line, suddenly it becomes a priority. But when it only affects the dignity and rights of your passengers of color, it's an isolated incident to be handled with a quiet settlement. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Richard Montgomery, accustomed to wielding enormous corporate power, found himself in the unusual position of supplicant. Elijah Washington, so recently denied the basic dignity of boarding the flight he'd paid for, now held the fate of an entire airline in his hands. And the transformation was just beginning. Richard Montgomery was visibly sweating now, droplets forming on his forehead despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. The Atlantic Airways CEO had arrived expecting to quickly resolve what he thought was a technical glitch. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a rapidly escalating PR catastrophe with his company's entire operation held hostage. Bradley Keller, you're terminated effective immediately, Montgomery announced loudly, making sure everyone recording could hear. Turn in your credentials and leave the premises. Keller stood frozen, the public humiliation rendering him momentarily speechless. Sir, I've been with the company for 15 years, he finally managed to stammer. And you've just cost us millions in a single afternoon, Montgomery replied coldly. Security will escort you out. As a mortified Keller was led away by airport security, the same officers who had been ready to remove Elijah minutes earlier, Montgomery turned back to Elijah with a politician's smile. Mr. Washington, I hope this demonstrates how seriously we take this matter. Now, if you could authorize your company to restore our systems, we can discuss appropriate compensation for your inconvenience. Elijah studied Montgomery's face. The apology was performative, designed for the cameras rather than genuine contrition. The CEO had responded to a business threat, not a moral failing. Firing one employee doesn't address the systemic issues, Elijah replied calmly. And I wasn't inconvenienced, Mr. Montgomery. I was discriminated against. Montgomery's smile tightened. Of course. Poor choice of words on my part. What would you suggest as an appropriate resolution? Before Elijah could respond, the situation escalated further. A small crew from a local news station pushed through the gathering crowd, a reporter with a microphone leading the way. Mr. Montgomery. Shanice Davis from Channel 7 News. Can you comment on reports that Atlantic Airways' entire computer system has crashed following a racial discrimination incident? The CEO's face froze in a rictus smile as cameras trained on him. More reporters were arriving, drawn by the social media firestorm that had erupted. #Atlantic Airways shutdown was now trending nationally, with videos of the confrontation being shared thousands of times per minute. We're experiencing a temporary technical issue, Montgomery began, falling back on corporate speak. And there's been an unfortunate misunderstanding with one of our valued customers that we're resolving. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Elijah interrupted, his voice calm but carrying. The reporters immediately swung their cameras toward him. I was denied boarding in first class explicitly because of my race, despite having a valid ticket. When I calmly questioned this discrimination, your staff escalated the situation and threatened me with security. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions simultaneously. Montgomery attempted to regain control of the narrative, but Elijah continued with measured precision. This isn't about me personally, he explained. I'm the CEO of Washington Securities, the company that provides cybersecurity infrastructure for Atlantic Airways. I have the resources to fight back when I'm discriminated against. But what about the countless passengers of color who don't? Who suffer these indignities silently because they have no recourse? Montgomery's forced smile had completely disappeared now. Mr. Washington, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. I think transparency is essential here, Elijah responded. The public deserves to know how Atlantic Airways treats its passengers of color, and what happens when someone finally has the power to demand accountability. More passengers began coming forward, emboldened by Elijah's stand. A middle-aged black woman approached the news crew. "I fly Atlantic twice a month for business," she said. "I've been asked to verify my first-class ticket 3 separate times while watching white passengers board without question." A Latino man joined her. "Last year, a flight attendant asked me to move from my assigned seat in first class because another passenger would be more comfortable there. When I refused, they threatened to have me removed from the flight." As more stories emerged, it became clear that what happened to Elijah was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. The narrative was slipping further from Montgomery's control with each new testimony. Tanya stepped forward, her tablet displaying data she had been collecting. "We've been monitoring social media since this incident began. In the past hour alone, over 500 people have shared similar experiences of discrimination on Atlantic Airways flights. This suggests a systemic problem, not a single bad apple employee." The mounting evidence was damning. Montgomery's expression shifted from damage control to desperation as he realized the full scope of the crisis. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice now genuinely pleading, "our airline is losing approximately $2 million per hour with our systems down. Passengers are stranded nationwide. Please, let's find a resolution that addresses your concerns while allowing us to resume operations." "My concerns?" Elijah repeated. "My concerns are for every person who has ever been humiliated, denied service, or treated as less than human by your airline because of the color of their skin. Firing one manager doesn't fix that." The power dynamic had completely reversed. The CEO of a major airline was now practically begging a man who, just an hour earlier, his staff had deemed unworthy of sitting in first class. "What do you want?" Montgomery asked plainly, abandoning pretense. "Systemic change," Elijah replied without hesitation. "Not promises, not PR statements, but verifiable, measurable change in how Atlantic Airways operates." "Fine," Montgomery agreed quickly. "We'll review our policies, provide additional training." "Companies have been promising that for decades," Elijah interrupted. "I'm talking about binding commitments with real consequences for failure. Independent audits of your practices. Transparent reporting of discrimination complaints. Structural changes in how you hire, train, and promote employees." Montgomery's face tightened as he calculated the costs of such demands against the mounting losses from the system outage. "That's a significant undertaking." "So is building an airline where all paying customers are treated with equal dignity," Elijah countered. As they stood at this impasse, Grace Hoffman, the attorney who had first spoken up for Elijah, approached again. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I believe I can help formalize these demands. My firm specializes in corporate accountability and civil rights." The offer of legal assistance seemed to further deflate Montgomery's resistance. The situation had evolved beyond a simple customer service issue into potential class action territory, with witnesses, video evidence, and hundreds of corroborating accounts flooding social media. "How long will it take to restore the systems once we reach an agreement?" Montgomery asked, conceding that negotiation was inevitable. "The maintenance protocol has a minimum 4-hour cycle," Elijah explained. "But it can be extended indefinitely until the security concern is addressed." The implication was clear: Atlantic Airways would remain grounded until meaningful change was guaranteed. Each hour meant millions more in losses, passenger compensation, and incalculable reputational damage. "I need to consult with our board," Montgomery said, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "Can we at least begin the restoration process while negotiations are ongoing?" "That would remove any incentive for genuine change," Tanya pointed out. "History suggests corporations prioritize quick fixes over addressing root causes when the pressure is off." Montgomery's phone buzzed continuously with calls from board members, executives, and undoubtedly lawyers assessing the company's exposure. The once powerful CEO now looked like a man watching his career implode in real time. "We'll need a conference room," he finally conceded. "And our legal team will want to be present." As arrangements were made for the impromptu negotiation, Elijah reflected on the irony. He had arrived at the airport as a customer, been treated as an intruder, and now stood as the arbiter of the airline's fate. The same power structures that had enabled his humiliation were now scrambling to appease him. But this wasn't about personal vindication. It was about using a moment of leverage to create lasting change for those who would never have such power. As he prepared to enter negotiations, Elijah knew that what happened next would extend far beyond one airline or one incident. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely rewritten. Inside a hastily arranged conference room near the Atlantic Airways lounge, tension hung thick in the air. On one side of the polished table sat Elijah Washington and Tanya Wilson, joined by Grace Hoffman, who had offered her legal expertise. On the other side, Richard Montgomery had assembled a crisis team, Atlantic Airways chief legal counsel, the head of public relations, and 2 board members who had been at the airport for their meeting. What had begun as a simple boarding denial had evolved into a full corporate reckoning. As Atlantic Airways flights remained grounded across the country, the true scope of the problem was beginning to emerge. "Our preliminary investigation is deeply troubling," Grace announced, sliding a tablet across the table. "This isn't Bradley Keller's first incident. Not even close." The airline executives exchanged uncomfortable glances as they reviewed the document. "Where did you get this information?" demanded Barbara Winters, Atlantic's chief legal counsel. "Former employees," Tanya explained. "Once the story broke, we received dozens of messages from people who'd witnessed similar behavior from Mr. Keller. Many had reported him internally, but nothing was ever done." The document detailed 14 separate incidents over the past 3 years where Keller had subjected passengers of color to additional scrutiny, denied boarding, or arranged random security checks. Each incident had been reported through proper channels. Each had been dismissed or buried. "This is just one employee," Grace continued. "But the pattern extends beyond him. Atlantic Airways has settled 27 discrimination claims in the past 3 years alone, all with strict non-disclosure agreements. Have you ever witnessed discrimination being swept under the rug by large corporations? Comment number 1 if you believe companies use NDAs to hide systemic problems, or number 2 if you think settlements are legitimate ways to resolve issues. Hit that like button if you think transparency is essential for real accountability, and subscribe to see more stories of corporate responsibility. But what happens when the cover-ups are finally exposed? "Those settlements are confidential," Winters objected. "The exact terms are," Grace acknowledged. "But the existence of the cases is public record. And we've been contacted by 5 former plaintiffs who are willing to break their NDAs if necessary. They believe the public interest outweighs their contractual obligations." Montgomery paled at this threat. The settlements had been designed precisely to keep these stories out of the public eye. "There's more," Tanya said, pulling up another document. "We've identified a disturbing pattern in how complaints are handled within your organization." The new document revealed that Vincent Parker, the operations director who had backed Keller's discrimination, had been involved in dismissing at least 11 internal complaints about discriminatory treatment from both passengers and employees of color. "Mr. Parker appears to be a key enabler in this system," Tanya explained. "When discrimination complaints reach him, they mysteriously disappear or are classified as misunderstandings regardless of evidence." Montgomery rubbed his temples, visibly distressed. "I wasn't aware of these specific cases. That's part of the problem," Elijah interrupted. "These issues never reach the executive level because your company has built a system designed to insulate leadership from accountability. Lower-level managers handle the complaints, issue denials, and when necessary, legal steps in with settlements and NDAs." As if on cue, Tanya's tablet pinged with a new notification. "We're receiving more testimonials," she reported. "Current and former Atlantic Airways employees are coming forward with their experiences. She displayed a message from a flight attendant. I reported a first-class cabin crew member who routinely lost the meal preferences of black passengers or served them last. Management told me I was being oversensitive and removed me from premium cabin assignments after I persisted. Another came from a former gate agent. Vincent Parker told me explicitly to watch for certain types trying to board in zones they didn't belong in. When I asked what he meant, he just said, "You know what I mean." I did know, and it made me sick. The stories continued to pour in, painting a picture of a corporate culture where discrimination was tacitly accepted and those who challenged it faced consequences. What's perhaps most disturbing, Grace noted, is the complete lack of diversity in Atlantic's executive leadership and regional management. Out of 47 regional managers, only 2 are people of color. There are no black executives at the VP level or above. The statistics were damning. In an industry serving a diverse customer base, Atlantic Airways leadership remained overwhelmingly white and male, creating blind spots that allowed discriminatory practices to flourish unchecked. "We have diversity initiatives," protested Diane Chen, the public relations director. "Our annual report highlights our commitment to inclusion. PR statements and actual practices are often worlds apart," Elijah observed. "Your company talks about diversity while maintaining systems that actively suppress it." As the meeting continued, media coverage of the incident was expanding. Major news networks had picked up the story, and #Atlantic Airways shutdown was now the top trending topic nationally. Financial analysts were beginning to question the airline's viability if the systems remained down much longer. "This could bankrupt the company," one of the board members muttered, checking stock alerts on his phone. "We're down 17% already, and the markets have only been open a few hours." The human cost behind the statistics became clearer as more testimonials emerged. A black executive described being asked to show his ticket 5 times on a single journey. A Latino family recounted being separated during boarding while white families were kept together. A Muslim woman detailed the humiliation of being removed from a flight after another passenger complained about her hijab making them uncomfortable. Each story revealed that what happened to Elijah wasn't an anomaly, it was simply the first time someone with the power to demand accountability had been targeted. "I don't understand why this is all coming out now," Montgomery said, frustration evident in his voice. "If these problems were so pervasive, why haven't we heard about them before?" "Because you created a system designed not to hear," Elijah replied simply. "When people complained, they were dismissed. When they persisted, they were silenced with settlements and NDAs. When employees raised concerns, they were marginalized or pushed out." Tanya pulled up employee diversity statistics that showed a troubling pattern. Employees of color had significantly higher turnover rates than their white counterparts, particularly those who had filed internal complaints. "Your company doesn't just discriminate against passengers," Grace observed. "It systematically pushes out employees who challenge discriminatory practices." The evidence was becoming overwhelming. What had initially seemed like a single incident with Bradley Keller now appeared to be the tip of an iceberg, a manifestation of deeply rooted problems that permeated Atlantic Airways' corporate culture. For Elijah, the revelations created an internal conflict. As a businessman, he understood that leveraging this moment could bring personal vindication and advantages for his company. But as a black man who had faced discrimination throughout his life, he recognized a broader responsibility. "The question now," he said after a moment of reflection, "is whether Atlantic Airways is genuinely interested in addressing these systemic issues, or simply in getting its systems back online as quickly as possible." The executives exchanged glances, the calculation visible on their faces. Would they commit to meaningful change, or simply say whatever was necessary to end the crisis? "What would addressing these issues entail from your perspective?" Montgomery asked cautiously. It was the opening Elijah had been waiting for, a chance to transform an individual injustice into institutional change. As he prepared to outline his vision for reform, he knew that the next few hours would determine whether this moment became a footnote in corporate history or the beginning of a genuine transformation. The deeper problems had been exposed. Now came the harder part, creating solutions that would prevent them from happening again. Do you believe large corporations can truly change their culture, or do they just get better at hiding problems? Comment number 1 if you think external pressure can force real change, or number 2 if you believe change must come from within. Like this video if you want to see more companies held accountable, and subscribe to follow stories of corporate transformation. What would you demand if you were in Elijah's position? The conference room had transformed into a high-stakes negotiation chamber. Atlantic Airways leadership had called in additional executives via video conference, including their chief financial officer who reported that the system outage was now costing the airline approximately $2.3 million per hour in direct losses, not counting the incalculable reputational damage. Richard Montgomery, initially dismissive and then panicked, had now settled into a grim resignation. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer the CEO magnanimously addressing a customer complaint, he was a corporate leader fighting for his company's survival. Let's be clear about what's on the table, Elijah began, his voice steady. This isn't about me getting special treatment or compensation. This is about systematic change that will ensure no passenger faces discrimination when they fly with Atlantic Airways. Montgomery nodded cautiously. We're prepared to make changes to our training protocols and review our customer service procedures. That's a start, but insufficient, Elijah replied. Vague promises about reviews and training are the standard corporate response to discrimination incidents. They create the appearance of action without guaranteeing results. He slid a tablet across the table. These are our terms for resolving this situation. The airline executives huddled around the device, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as they reviewed the document. This is extensive, Montgomery finally said. So is the problem, Elijah countered. Barbara Winters, the legal counsel, spoke up. Some of these demands would require board approval. Others would involve significant operational changes and costs. And the cost of remaining grounded is what per hour? Tanya asked pointedly. The executives fell silent, confronted with the harsh mathematics of their situation. Every minute of negotiation was costing them tens of thousands of dollars. Mr. Montgomery, Elijah said, I understand your hesitation. What we're proposing represents a fundamental shift in how Atlantic Airways operates. But consider the alternative, continued financial bleeding as your systems remain down, followed by class action lawsuits as more passengers come forward with discrimination claims, culminating in a Department of Transportation investigation that your own internal documents show you would not fare well in. The clinical assessment of their vulnerability hung in the air. Atlantic Airways was caught in a vice grip of their own making, their discriminatory practices exposed just as their operational capacity had been neutralized. We need to bring in additional perspectives, Tanya suggested, breaking the tense silence. This isn't a problem that can be solved solely by the current leadership team, given that they've presided over the systems that created it. At her signal, a woman entered the conference room. This is Christine Bailey, Tanya introduced. She's one of the leading consultants on corporate diversity transformation and has helped several Fortune 500 companies address similar issues. Montgomery looked skeptical. We already have diversity consultants on retainer, who report to your HR department and have no actual authority to implement changes, Christine observed as she took a seat. I've reviewed your annual diversity reports. They're full of aspirational language but light on measurable outcomes. Christine opened her laptop and projected a comprehensive plan onto the wall screen. What you need isn't just diversity training. You need structural transformation, changes to hiring practices, promotion criteria, complaint procedures, and accountability measures. The plan she outlined was methodical and evidence-based. It included independent audits of passenger treatment broken down by race, mandatory review of all discrimination complaints by an external ethics committee, and compensation structures that tied executive bonuses to diversity and inclusion metrics. This isn't about feel-good seminars or symbolic gestures, Christine explained. This is about changing the incentives and systems that currently allow discrimination to flourish within your organization. Some board members appeared openly hostile to the proposals. "I don't see the business case for such extensive changes," objected Harold Fleming, a silver-haired board member with a permanent frown. "We're in the transportation business, not social engineering." Elijah leaned forward, his expression intense. "Let me explain the business case, Mr. Fleming. Discrimination costs American businesses billions annually in lost productivity, turnover, litigation, and reputational damage. Right now, your company is hemorrhaging money because one manager felt empowered to deny boarding to a black passenger in violation of your own policies." He pulled up financial projections on his tablet. "The changes we're proposing would cost approximately $22 million to implement fully over 3 years. Your systems have been down for less than 12 hours, and you've already lost over $25 million. The business case is crystal clear." The stark financial reality silenced even the most resistant board members. This wasn't just a moral argument, it was a matter of fiduciary responsibility. Montgomery glanced at his watch nervously. "How much longer will our systems remain down if we agree to these terms?" "That depends on how quickly we can reach a binding agreement," Elijah replied. "My company can begin the restoration process once we have signed commitments to the core elements of this plan." "And if we need more time to review these proposals?" Montgomery asked. "Then your systems remain down, your stock price continues to fall, and passengers remain stranded," Tanya stated matter-of-factly. "The deadline isn't arbitrary, it's directly tied to your willingness to address the underlying issues." The negotiation continued for hours, with intense debates over specific requirements and implementation timelines. Christine Bailey expertly addressed technical objections, while Grace Hoffman ensured that the legal language would create binding obligations rather than aspirational goals. Throughout the process, social media continued to amplify the story. #Black CEO Shutdown and #Atlantic Airways Reckoning were trending globally. Financial analysts were publishing increasingly dire predictions about the airline's prospects if the situation wasn't resolved quickly. "Our stock has fallen 23%, reported the CFO during a break in negotiations. "Major institutional investors are calling for answers. We need to issue a statement immediately." Montgomery looked haggard. "What do you suggest we say? That we can't get our planes off the ground because we discriminated against the CEO of our cybersecurity provider?" The blunt assessment captured their predicament perfectly. There was no spinning this situation, no corporate doublespeak that could obscure the fundamental reality. Atlantic Airways had built discriminatory practices into its operations, and now those chickens had come home to roost. As the afternoon wore on, resistance from the Atlantic Airways team gradually eroded. The financial pressure was simply too great to maintain their opposition. One by one, the key points of contention were resolved, with meaningful commitments replacing vague promises. By early evening, a comprehensive agreement had been drafted. It included independent audits of passenger treatment by race and ethnicity, overhaul of the complaint process with external oversight, binding diversity targets for executive leadership positions, mandatory anti-bias training with measurable outcome requirements, financial consequences for managers who violated anti-discrimination policies, regular public reporting of progress toward inclusion goals, establishment of a Passenger Advisory Council with significant representation from communities of color, if. "We sign this," Montgomery said, reviewing the final document. "How quickly can our systems be restored?" "The restoration process takes approximately 4 hours once initiated," Elijah explained. "But that happens only after the agreement is fully executed, not just promised." Montgomery looked to his legal team, who nodded reluctantly. They had negotiated as hard as possible under the circumstances, but the fundamental demands remained intact. There was simply no leverage to push back further as the financial damage mounted by the minute. "We'll sign," Montgomery finally conceded, his voice heavy with the knowledge that this agreement would transform his company in ways he had resisted throughout his career. As the documents were prepared for signatures, Elijah reflected on the unlikely path that had led to this moment. What began as yet another humiliating experience of discrimination had evolved into an opportunity to create systemic change that would benefit countless passengers who would never have the power he wielded. The agreement was signed just after 7 p.m., nearly 9 hours after Bradley Keller had denied Elijah boarding. With signatures in place, Elijah made another call to Washington Securities, authorizing the system restoration process to begin. The system should be partially operational within an hour, he informed Montgomery. Full functionality will return gradually over the next 4 hours. As the airline executives left to manage the recovery process, Tanya turned to Elijah. "Do you think they'll actually follow through?" "They don't have a choice," he replied. "The agreement includes independent verification and substantial penalties for non-compliance. More importantly, the world is watching now. There's no going back to business as usual." What had begun as a personal humiliation had culminated in a corporate transformation that would resonate throughout the industry. But as Elijah would soon discover, resistance to change rarely surrenders without a fight. The first Atlantic Airways flights resumed operations shortly before midnight. Weary passengers, stranded for hours, finally began their delayed journeys as the airline systems gradually came back online. Emergency crews had worked through the evening to clear the backlog, with priority given to those who had been waiting longest. For Elijah Washington, the resolution brought mixed emotions. He had ultimately reached San Francisco on a competitor's airline, arriving just in time to prepare for his crucial meeting with the Department of Defense. But the victory felt incomplete, shadowed by the knowledge that institutional change rarely comes easily or without resistance. "The backlash has already started," Tanya reported during their morning briefing in the San Francisco hotel. She turned her tablet to show him the headlines. Tech CEO holds airline hostage, Black businessman uses cyber leverage to force woke agenda, was Atlantic Airways shutdown an act of corporate terrorism? Right-wing media outlets had seized on the story, framing Elijah as a dangerous radical who had abused his technological power to advance political goals. The coverage conveniently omitted the discrimination that triggered the incident, focusing instead on the economic impact of the shutdown. "They're painting me as some kind of tech terrorist," Elijah observed, scrolling through the articles. Not surprising, but still disappointing. The Department of Defense meeting went well despite the controversy. The government representatives were more concerned with Washington Securities' technical capabilities than the airline incident. The $2 billion contract was preliminarily approved, pending final security clearances. But as Elijah and Tanya returned to their hotel afterward, the situation had deteriorated further. Death threats had begun arriving at Washington Securities offices. Social media was flooded with racist attacks against Elijah, many using language too vile to repeat. "We've had to increase security at all our offices," Tanya reported grimly. "And the police recommend you have personal protection for the foreseeable future." The corporate response was equally troubling. While Atlantic Airways publicly committed to implementing the agreement, internal resistance was already forming. Vincent Parker, the operations director who had backed Bradley Keller's discrimination, had been reassigned rather than terminated. He was now leading what the company called a regulatory compliance initiative, a vague role that kept him in a position of influence. "They're already trying to undermine the agreement," Tanya observed. Parker has been meeting with regional managers to discuss implementation challenges, basically identifying ways to meet the letter of the requirements while avoiding substantive change. Elijah wasn't surprised. Corporate America had perfected the art of performative compliance, creating the appearance of change while preserving existing power structures. He had anticipated resistance, which was why the agreement included independent verification mechanisms and specific penalties for non-compliance. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the personal cost. The controversy had made him a target, not just for random internet trolls but for organized hate groups who saw him as a symbol of black empowerment that threatened their worldview. "We've identified several credible threats," reported Keith Simmons, the security consultant Tanya had engaged. Most concerning is a coordinated doxing campaign that published your home address and daily schedule. The constant security concerns wore on Elijah. He had built his career focused on innovation and excellence, deliberately avoiding being typecast as a black entrepreneur, rather than simply an entrepreneur. Now he had been thrust into the center of a racial controversy that threatened to define him in the public eye. Even within Washington Securities, tensions emerged. Some board members expressed concern about the company's reputation becoming entangled with political issues. Others worried about potential contract cancellations from clients who disagreed with Elijah's actions. "Northrop has put our security contract review on hold," reported Marcus Chen, Washington Securities Chief Revenue Officer, during an emergency board call. They cited evolving evaluation criteria, but the timing suggests it's related to the Atlantic Airways situation. The pressure built over the following weeks. Atlantic Airways employees were divided, with some embracing the changes while others resisted. An anonymous group calling themselves Airline Employees for Merit began circulating internal memos claiming the new diversity initiatives would lower standards and prioritize identity over qualifications. Vincent Parker emerged as the unofficial leader of the resistance, working behind the scenes to sabotage implementation efforts. His tactics were subtle but effective, delaying key initiatives, misallocating resources, and cultivating skepticism among middle management. "We've identified a pattern," Tanya explained, showing Elijah internal documents obtained from sympathetic Atlantic Airways employees. "Parker has created a shadow implementation team that's systematically undermining Christine Bailey's work. They're technically following procedures while ensuring nothing actually changes." The sabotage might have succeeded if not for Tanya's network of informants within Atlantic Airways, employees of color who had suffered under the previous regime and were determined to see genuine reform. They provided crucial intelligence that allowed Elijah's team to document the resistance and hold the company accountable. Parker's team altered the anti-bias training materials to remove specific references to racial discrimination, one whistleblower reported. "They're framing everything as general customer service improvement rather than addressing the actual issues." Armed with this evidence, Elijah faced a difficult decision. The agreement gave him the right to take legal action if Atlantic Airways failed to implement the required changes in good faith. But doing so would escalate the controversy further, potentially jeopardizing the government contract that remained under final review. Washington Securities' own board was increasingly concerned about the situation. During a tense meeting, several directors questioned whether the ongoing battle was worth the cost. "We're a cybersecurity company, not a civil rights organization," argued Harold Freeman, one of the more conservative board members. "While what happened to you was inexcusable, Elijah, our primary responsibility is to our shareholders and employees." The criticism stung, particularly coming from someone Elijah had personally recruited to the board. He found himself questioning his own actions. Had he gone too far in using his company's leverage to force change? Or not far enough in ensuring that change would actually take root? The pressure reached its peak when the Department of Defense contract was unexpectedly placed under additional review, citing security concerns that had suddenly emerged. The timing suggested political interference, likely from figures sympathetic to Atlantic Airways or opposed to Elijah's activism. That evening, feeling the weight of it all, Elijah visited his grandmother in her modest home in Baltimore. At 92, Eleanor Washington had lived through the civil rights movement, marching with Dr. King and facing water cannons and police dogs in the struggle for equality. Her perspective had always grounded him. "They're saying I went too far," Elijah confessed as they sat in her small living room. "That I should have handled it differently." Eleanor's eyes, still sharp despite her age, fixed on him with intensity. "They always say that about people who demand justice instead of asking politely for it. They said the same about Dr. King, you know. Today they quote his speeches, but back then they called him an extremist for wanting basic dignity. But using my company's position." "You used the power you had," she interrupted firmly. "That's what power is for, to create change that matters. Change never comes easily, child. The people who benefit from the old ways never give up their advantage without a fight. Her words resonated deeply. Throughout history, meaningful change had always faced resistance. Those who initiated it were rarely celebrated in their time, often vilified instead for disrupting comfortable inequities. What matters isn't what they call you today, Eleanor continued, taking his hand in her weathered one. It's whether children who look like you will face the same humiliations tomorrow. That's the only measure that counts. The conversation with his grandmother restored Elijah's resolve. The following morning, he called an emergency meeting with his executive team and the Atlantic Airways Implementation Committee. We've documented systematic efforts to undermine the agreement, he announced, displaying the evidence Tanya had compiled. This constitutes a breach of contract that would justify reinstating the system maintenance protocol. The threat sent shockwaves through Atlantic Airways. The prospect of another shutdown, especially now that the public was watching, was unthinkable. Richard Montgomery himself reached out within hours, requesting an urgent meeting. We've removed Vincent Parker from all implementation responsibilities, Montgomery reported the next day, looking distinctly uncomfortable. And we've accelerated the diversity hiring initiatives. I want to personally assure you that Atlantic Airways is fully committed to honoring our agreement. The confrontation marked a turning point. With the resistance exposed and the consequences of failure made clear, genuine implementation finally began in earnest. Christine Bailey was given real authority, reporting directly to the board rather than through management that could impede her work. For Elijah, the victory came with a sobering recognition. Creating change required not just the initial stand but constant vigilance to ensure that commitments translated into action. The easy part was getting people to sign agreements, the hard part was making those agreements mean something in practice. As the Department of Defense completed its additional review and finally approved the contract, Elijah reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple attempt to board a flight. The struggle wasn't over, perhaps it never would be entirely, but something fundamental had shifted, not just for Atlantic Airways but for an industry that had long treated discrimination as a public relations problem rather than a moral failing. The real test would come in the months ahead, as promised changes either took root or withered under the inevitable pressures to return to business as usual. But for the first time, Elijah felt cautiously optimistic that this particular corporation might actually transform rather than simply adapt its defenses. Change had begun. Now it was time to ensure it would last. 6 months after the incident that had grounded an entire airline, Elijah Washington stood in the terminal at Reagan National Airport once again. This time, he was not alone. Christine Bailey walked beside him, now permanently installed as Atlantic Airways' first Chief Diversity Officer, a position with genuine authority and direct reporting lines to the board of directors. The changes are significant, Christine explained as they toured the facility. Not just cosmetic adjustments, but fundamental shifts in how the airline operates. The transformation was visible even in small details. The gate areas now featured more diverse staff. Signs were posted in multiple languages. Most importantly, a new customer advocacy office had been established right in the terminal, staffed by representatives trained to address concerns about discrimination immediately. We've implemented comprehensive anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, Christine continued. Not the superficial kind that checks a box, but evidence-based programs with measurable outcomes and regular refresher courses. The training went beyond generic diversity statements to address specific scenarios and implicit biases that affected passenger treatment. Gate agents, flight attendants, and other frontline employees participated in regular workshops where they confronted uncomfortable truths about differential treatment based on race, religion, and ethnicity. Behind the scenes, even more substantial changes had taken place. Atlantic Airways had launched an ambitious hiring initiative to bring diverse talent into leadership positions. 6 months in, the airline had already increased its minority representation in management by 18%, with targets to reach parity with the national population within 3 years. The complaint procedure has been completely overhauled, Christine explained as they visited the new Passenger Advocacy Center. Any allegation of discrimination now triggers an immediate review by an independent committee that includes outside experts and community representatives. The statistics were encouraging. Reported incidents of discriminatory treatment had initially increased as passengers felt empowered to speak up, but the trend was now reversing as staff behavior improved under the new accountability measures. Customer satisfaction scores among passengers of color had risen dramatically, indicating that the changes were having their intended effect. Bradley Keller and Vincent Parker had not gone quietly into the night. They had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Atlantic Airways, claiming they were scapegoats for broader institutional issues. The case had been dismissed by a federal judge who found their claims without merit given the substantial evidence of discriminatory conduct. Atlantic Airways itself had weathered the initial financial storm and was now recovering steadily. After an initial plunge, the airline stock had stabilized and begun to climb again as investors recognized that the company's new approach was not just ethically sound but good business. Improved customer satisfaction translated into stronger loyalty, particularly among the growing demographic of travelers of color. For Elijah, the transformation extended beyond Atlantic Airways. His stand had unexpectedly transformed him into a corporate activist, with CEOs from various industries seeking his counsel on addressing systemic discrimination within their organizations. What began as a personal humiliation had evolved into a platform for broader change. "We've expanded Washington Securities to include a corporate culture auditing division," Elijah explained to Christine as they continued their tour. "Technology gives us unique insights into how policies translate into practices within large organizations." The new division used data analytics to identify patterns of differential treatment that might otherwise remain hidden in corporate systems. Several major companies had already engaged their services, recognizing that addressing discrimination wasn't just morally right but fiscally prudent in an increasingly diverse marketplace. The government contract that had been the original purpose of Elijah's trip to San Francisco had been successfully executed, with an unexpected bonus. The Department of Defense had added ethical business requirements to the specifications, influenced by the Atlantic Airways incident. Washington Securities' approach to corporate responsibility had become a competitive advantage rather than a liability. As they reached Gate 35, the very spot where Elijah had been denied boarding 6 months earlier, they paused to observe the current boarding process. A diverse group of passengers moved smoothly through the priority lane, their documents checked with consistent courtesy regardless of appearance or attire. "We still have work to do," Christine acknowledged. "Cultural change doesn't happen overnight. But the systems and incentives are now aligned to promote inclusion rather than enable discrimination." The most powerful evidence came when Elijah noticed a young black tech entrepreneur in casual clothes being treated with the same respect and efficiency as every other first-class passenger. The young man moved through the boarding process without incident, his humanity and dignity fully recognized. "That's what this was all about," Elijah remarked quietly. "Not just changing one airline's policies, but creating spaces where people can exist without having their belonging questioned based on how they look." The transformation wasn't perfect or complete, no human institution ever achieves that ideal. Bias still existed, as it does throughout society. But Atlantic Airways had fundamentally altered its approach to addressing that bias, shifting from denial and defensiveness to acknowledgement and action. For Elijah personally, the journey had been both costly and rewarding. The threats and backlash had eventually subsided, though he still maintained enhanced security precautions. His public profile had grown, creating new opportunities to influence corporate behavior beyond his own industry. Most importantly, the incident had connected him to a broader movement for accountability and equity in American business. What happened at Gate 35 wasn't an isolated event but part of a longer struggle that continued across countless industries and institutions. As Elijah prepared to board his flight, on Atlantic Airways, deliberately chosen for this follow-up visit, he reflected on his grandmother's wisdom about the true measure of change, whether children who looked like him would face the same humiliations tomorrow. The answer wasn't yet a definitive no, too much work remained for that. But for the first time, it seemed like a genuine possibility rather than a distant dream. The systems that enabled discrimination were being dismantled, not just at one airline but across an industry that had taken note of what happened to Atlantic Airways. "Mr. Washington," called a gate agent with a professional smile. "We're ready to begin boarding if you'd like to proceed." As Elijah moved forward, his first-class boarding pass scanned without comment or additional scrutiny, he recognized the moment for what it was, not the end of a journey, but a meaningful milestone along the way. The transformation of Atlantic Airways demonstrated what was possible when power was wielded purposefully to create lasting change. Walking down the jetway, Elijah thought about all the passengers of color who would board this flight and thousands of others without facing the humiliation he had experienced. Some would never know the story behind the changes that improved their experience. Others would recognize that progress rarely comes by accident, but through the deliberate actions of those willing to stand firm when it would be easier to step aside. The true victory wasn't just in the policies changed or the executives hired, but in the subtle shift toward a world where dignity wasn't determined by appearance, where belonging wasn't questioned based on skin color, and where accountability wasn't optional but essential. As the plane lifted off toward its destination, Elijah understood that his own journey had been forever altered by what began as a routine business trip. The path forward would continue to present challenges, but it would also offer opportunities to transform individual incidents into institutional improvements. That, perhaps, was the most important lesson: power, when directed toward justice rather than personal advantage, could create ripples that extended far beyond a single confrontation at an airport gate. What do you think about Elijah's approach to fighting discrimination? Have you ever witnessed someone using their position to create positive change? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to like this video if you believe in holding corporations accountable. Subscribe to hear more stories of everyday heroes transforming their industries from within. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is refusing to accept it as inevitable. Elijah Washington's story teaches us that true change requires more than moral outrage, it demands strategic action. When faced with discrimination, he didn't just express anger, he leveraged his unique position to force accountability. His journey reminds us that systemic problems require systemic solutions. The transformation of Atlantic Airways demonstrates that corporations respond to consequences, not just complaints. While public shaming might create temporary embarrassment, financial pressure drives institutional change. By linking discrimination directly to the bottom line, Elijah created incentives for reform that mere moral arguments couldn't achieve. Perhaps most importantly, this story highlights the responsibility that comes with privilege and power. Elijah could have accepted compensation and moved on, but he recognized his ability to create change for others who lacked his leverage. He understood that victories against discrimination aren't measured by personal vindication but by institutional transformation. Finally, we learn that lasting change requires vigilance. The initial agreement was just the beginning, ensuring implementation demanded ongoing monitoring and readiness to apply pressure when needed. Justice isn't achieved through single moments of triumph but through persistent effort to hold power accountable. Have you ever stood up against discrimination or witnessed someone using their influence for positive change? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more powerful accounts of justice and transformation. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Thank you for joining me on this journey toward a more equitable world.